Hello everyone, welcome to the series of news podcasts by Sosain Classes. All the news you need and more. Today we'll be picking up two areas of relevance for UPSC. Today's series of news podcasts, we will be discussing geopolitics of the Middle East with respect to Israel and the GST compensation that is due to states from the center. The first article is about Palestine, UAE, Bahrain, Israel with US brokered talks. This article talks about how Bahrain is the fourth Arab country to normalize ties with Israel and how it goes against the Arab Peace Initiative that was initiated in 2002 by Saudi Arabia. Now this has angered Palestinians to no extent. So they have called for an immediate emergency session of the Arab League and Organization of Islamic Cooperation to reject both the deals made by UAE and Bahrain in the last month. Now let us see in this article, with respect to this, we will see what are the recent happenings with respect to UAE and Bahrain and what it means for the region and all of the parties and the history of the conflict of Palestine and Israel. Now, Israel, Bahrain and UAE normalization deal. The Arab nations do not recognize Israel. There are only 4 countries currently that recognize Israel. First one is Egypt, which had signed the recognition deal almost 30 years after the conflict of Israel and Palestine had begun. And 15 years after this, Jordan had done so. And almost 25 years later, UAE had come to this deal. But only within 1 month after UAE signing the deal, Bahrain has filed a deal. So, Donald Trump had tweeted, the second Arab country to make peace with Israel in 30 days. And this is on after 13th of August where UAE and Israel had signed a deal which normalized relationships. High-level delegations had flown from Israel and US which arrived in UAE to over the first ever commercial flight that flew over the Middle Eastern nations, and Saudi Arabia had allowed their airspace to be used, and this was the first of its kind. Saudi Arabia actually in 2002 had implemented a peace initiative where it had wanted Israel to return back to its 1948 borders and return back the areas it had annexed in the 1967 war against Syria, Jordan and Egypt, and return all the areas back to Palestine in return for recognition of the state. The main problem is Israel is very isolated and in its region, and all its neighbors do not like it, which leads to heavy investment in defense and constant problems that they face. Freedom of speech is actually highly restricted in UAE and Saudi Arabia, but nonetheless, in recent days, Gulfies against normalization has been trending according to a Reuters report. Egypt and Jordan were the first countries to recognize Israel. In 1979, Egypt had signed a deal with Israel, and the president who had signed this deal had been assassinated, and the Arab League suspended Egypt from their membership in response to this deal. And in 1994, Jordan and Israel also had signed a peace deal where half of the population of Palestinian descent actually lives in Jordan. So this required their representation. And at the same time, Israel was in negotiation with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was the official body of Palestine. And because of this, there is a lot of change in the region's geopolitics. And in return for this peace deal in 1979, the Israelis had returned the Sinai Peninsula back to the Egyptians. Now, what is in it for the parties that have signed the normalization deal, and what is it for US? We'll see in this slide and in the coming slides. Israel craves recognition from its neighbors, and also in terms of trade and economic growth, these are amazing markets for Israel, as Israeli diplomats often say that their country is too small and to scale up production and to gain benefit of their innovative technologies, they must trade with neighboring countries, which is actually in most economic theory, it is said that with your neighbors, if you have good trade relationships and high volume of trade, it also is a indicator for economic prosperity. There are religious differences in the region between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia is the leading Sunni Muslim power, and Iran is a constant problem in the region, and it's a Shiite majority country. And this has led to feeling of alienation, since US is withdrawing its troops from the region in order to reduce the troops or abroad and to end the endless wars that US is fighting. And it is the policy of Donald Trump's bring the troops back home. So because of this, there's a security vacuum in the region, and these Arab nations feel Israel can help them against Iran. And with military aid, Israel is the most technologically advanced in the region, and they have very high tech military, and they also have been provided by the F-16s from the US, which a lot of these countries have been wanting to have. And if their relationship with Israel is good, they will get these F-16s from the US maybe in the future. 193 UN member states recognize Israel. 29 UN members still do not recognize Israel. 16 out of these 22 Arab states do not recognize Israel. Some examples are Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia. 9 countries of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which includes Pakistan and Afghanistan, also do not recognize Israel. Some other countries are Cuba, Bhutan, North Korea, and Venezuela, which also do not recognize Israel. So the Israel and the Gulf Arab states began establishing some kind of tentative links after the Oslo 1993 peace accords, where they had signed a deal with Palestinian Liberation Organization, and they had opened trade missions in each other's capitals, which was closed after the 2000 eruptions of violence in the Palestinian borders. You can see on the left, this is the present day map of Israel and Palestine. The one in the light brown, this is the West Bank, and this is the current day strip of Gaza, which is actually Palestine. Golan Heights, this area, which is a part of Syria, was occupied by Israel in the 1967 war, and it is still under Israel. They have not given it back. So please note this, and you can see in the image here, 6-day war of 1967, how it has changed borders. You may pause and look at it. We will anyway discuss it in the coming slides. In 1947, the UN had made a partition plan of this region, where it had divided it into a proposed Jewish state and a proposed Arab state. As you can see, in 1947, Israel was almost, non-existent. Like not non-existent, but it had a very small region as compared to what we had seen in the previous slide. The brown regions of Gaza, West Bank, and another added region in the north was the proposed Palestinian state. As you can see, the Gaza Strip today is like not even 1/6 of the proposed strip. And in June of 1948, Arab armies invaded because they did not like this partition plan. The countries of Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria had invaded this region, and they had pushed Israel back into this little light colored region. But in a change of events, Israel had fought back, and it ended up claiming areas which were not even part of the original partition plan, and established completely new borders. Now the green is what was left for the Palestinians, which is completely opposite of this image here. Now after this, in the 1967 Israeli-Arab war, it set today's borders. The map on the left, this one, shows Palestinian areas of Gaza, which was actually under Egyptian control, and the West Bank, under Jordanian control. In 1967, these people fought a war, and the war ended up with Israel occupying Golan Heights, which you can see here in Syria, and Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. That's shown on the right map here, Sinai. And Israel gave Sinai back as a part of the 1979 peace deal between Egypt and Israel. But there's still an economic blockade in parts of Gaza, and the West Bank is increasingly being filled with Israeli soldiers, and Golan Heights is still not given back. In this map, you can see the orange areas which recognize Palestine and Israel, the yellow ones that recognize only Palestine, which is majority of North Africa and the Gulf countries, and some Muslim dominated countries of Indonesia, etc. And the red ones recognize only Israel. India recognizes both. USA, Mexico, Canada, Australia recognize only Israel. Now let's see some highlights. Bahrain is the fourth Arab country to recognize Israel and to sign a peace deal. Iran is a major threat in the region, which is why these Arab countries are going for this deal. The 1967 war changed borders of Israel and Palestine. The new deals which have taken place with UAE and Bahrain almost do not take into consideration the Palestinian concerns. USA gains foreign policy clout as Donald Trump wanted to end the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and since that did not happen, at least his bringing Israel into the picture gives him major foreign policy clout, since Israel and America are very good friends and USA was the first country to recognize Israel. This article deals with GST compensation due to states. This article basically says that due to COVID and due to lockdown, the GST collection for the months of April and August is due at Rs 1.51 lakh crores. It is the highest for Maharashtra, followed by Karnataka, UP, Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. Now, this is in reference to the 2.35 lakh crore of revenue shortfall of the current fiscal year of GST collections. And the center is supposed to compensate the states until the year of 2022 of the shortfall in revenue they face due to the introduction of GST, which we will see later. How the center compensates it is by levying a cess on luxury, demerit and sin goods, and they have given an option of extending this beyond 2022 to repay. Last month, the center had given options to the states to borrow funds through a special facilitated window by RBI, where the center says they will pay back the principal or they may also pay back the principal and interest. The GST Council is yet to take a decision, and we will also see what the GST Council is. So in reference to this article, we will see what the GST compensation to states is and what is the formula. As we have already discussed, that it is based on the center taxing sin, demerit and luxury goods. Then what is a GST? An overview of that. We will not go into so much detail, and we will see what is the overview of this entire article. The pre-indirect tax structure in India. So first there were the central taxes, and then also there were the state taxes. But in state taxes there were multiple, like entries tax and octroi, entertainment tax, electronic duty, luxury tax, VAT and state levies. And all of these had different acts and different rules. So each one was administered by different people. Now there's so many acts and so many rules and so many different rates for different states. It was extremely tedious to administer all of them, and there were a lot of procedures also, because under VAT there are different forms. Under luxury tax, when you had to file, there were different forms. So this was all very, very difficult and tedious. And then there was central levies also. Again, this also had different administration, different rules and procedures. So now with central and state, now you can imagine the number of taxes, administration forms and all that was there. But under central, essentially there are customs, excise, service tax and central sales tax earlier. Now all of this combined has given us the GST structure in India. It's a single tax. Now there's only one body that will be administering it. It's a uniform law, so there are no multiple rates and multiple forms which have to be kept in mind. And it is computerized, which is very important. Earlier, mostly forms had to be manually filled. And under GST also, there is CGST, SGST, UTGST and IGST. IGST stands for integrated, and CGST stands for central, and SGST and UGGST stands for state and union territory. Now let's see some items which are exempted from GST, because these are essentials, so they didn't want to tax it. There's curd, there's prasad, because this comes under religious denominations and they usually do not have to pay a lot of taxes to the government. And there is pamira or jaggery, salt, gur, health services, kajal, education services, milk. So these are a few examples of the public consumption products which has reduced tax rates. And there are also a couple of things which have no GST. Now we'll see what is a GST Council. Now this is a constitutional body, which one we must keep in mind. And next thing is that it makes recommendations to the union and states government on issues relating to GST. It is chaired by the Union Finance Minister and the Union State Minister of Revenue or Finance, and ministers in charge of finance and taxation of all states. Now let's see these points. It's a joint forum of both central and state. It will function under the chairmanship of the Union Finance Minister and will have ministers nominated by the states and union territories. So this is the chairman, and plus there is another very important member, which is the Minister of Revenue for state. The council will act as a benchmark and will guide the states and union territories on issues like tax rates, exemptions, lists, threshold limits, etc. The central government shall have a weightage of 1/3 of the total votes cast. The votes of all the state governments taken together shall have a weightage of 2/3 of the total votes cast. So basically state governments have a little higher say, because they had to secede a lot of their state taxes, which is the revenue, to bring in this GST. So they will have some compensation, which we will see in the other slides. 101st Amendment of the Constitution, the GST had come into force in 2017. Of course, there are different states which had to ratify it, at least 50% for it to actually become an amendment later. And there are three different acts. One is for the integrated one, and one is for the state and central. But what happened after this had happened is that now the states no longer possessed taxation rights. States earlier had a lot of taxation opportunities, like that of VAT, octroi, service tax, luxury tax, entertainment tax, etc. So apart from petroleum, alcohol, stamp duty, all the others were subsumed into GST. Now this is important because GST accounts for almost 42% of the state's own tax revenues, and tax revenues account for about 60% of state's total revenue. So this is very important. Now they had to cede all of this. So there had to be something done for them, because they had agreed to do this. So which is why central government required that there will be a bill which is called the GST Compensation to States Act, which was also passed in 2017, which promised that from 2017 to 2022, the central government, if there is any lag of revenue between what is projected for the particular state and what is lagging, the central government will pay this compensation to the particular state. And how did they calculate this? They calculated it at 14% compounded annual growth rate, and this was equal for all states. And because of this, now the central is required to compensate states for GST, because now it has changed from origin based to destination based. A lot of states will lose out, since they have manufacturing hubs, but if it is being collected at a place of consumption, it's going to be difficult. For example, states like Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, and especially southern states which have a lot of manufacturing going on, now they will particularly lose out. The article we have discussed is that COVID has affected GST collection, and it has also affected the economy, and demand has fallen and GDP has also fallen. And according to the bill passed by the center in 2017, the center is supposed to compensate the states due to the loss of state government's revenue due to the introduction of GST, and this is because GST subsumes a lot of indirect taxes except customs currently. Now let us go to our daily news diary segment, and I will read out some questions for you so that you can practice at home. These are the questions for mains. The first one is from the general essay paper, which reads, explain what and why of the farmers' protests on the 3 ordinances that will corporatize agriculture. The second one is from GS paper 2, why the Bahrain-Israel deal is being mourned as Black Day for the Palestinians. We have already seen this, so you may take your answers from the current things that we have discussed. The other one is, how high are the chances of reinfection with coronavirus? Explain its biological mechanism and evolved socio-cultural effects. The another question, which is a short question from GS paper 2, is what is the government of India's stand on recognizing same-sex marriages? From GS paper 1, what is the life harboring gas that has been found on Venus? And from GS paper 3, what is retail inflation and its current status in the economy? You may also add the GST perspective to this answer. Now, we will see a prelims practice question for today. This is based on GST, so please attempt it. The total provisions of GST compensation due to 31 states and union territories for 2021 put together stand at 1.51 lakh crores, with highest for Maharashtra followed by Karnataka, UP, Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. In the current fiscal year, states has a staggering 2.35 lakh crore GST revenue shortfall. Centre gave 2 options to borrow 97,000 crore from special window facilitated by RBI or 2.35 crore from the market. Also proposed extending the compensation cess levied on luxury demerits in goods beyond 2022. Please see which one of them is true. We have just discussed all the provisions of this question. From yesterday, the question was, what is the Special Frontier Force also called as? It is known as Vikas Battalion. Please go ahead and try out all these questions, and you can refer to the answers posted on the Susain Classes official website. This is a wrap on your news podcast. Tomorrow is another day with another news. Please leave your comments and reviews in the comment section below and subscribe to our channel for daily updates. Thank you.